this exciting encounter between Magnus Carlsen and Nordirbek Abdusattorov. Nordirbek now world number 4, one of the best in the world, but at this point of the game, he was just a 2600 GM, only 14 years old. Let's see how he fares against Magnus. Magnus goes for this Tore attack, as it's called, with the bishop on g5, and Nordirbek goes for a very solid setup. We now slowly are seeming to move into the Queen's Gambit decline territory, just that this knight on b1 hasn't been developed. Magnus chops off the knight, gives his opponent the bishop pair, but says to Nordirbek that your remaining bishop on c8 is not very active. What are you going to do about it? And he goes h4. Well, Magnus is actually going all out. You can see Nordirbek just pausing a bit. He's 14 years old, but it's Magnus who has this youthful energy right now. Maybe he wants to go g4, g5, just open up the queen and the rook. Nordirbek plays g6, being very careful. Magnus now gets his knight out, logical to develop, also getting ready to long castle. And Nordirbek puts his bishop back. So safety first approach by the youngster, and that is wise when you're facing the world champion. Long castle. Magnus is not stopping at just h4. He's going to go all out. c6. Is he going to play g4 as well? Is that on his mind? Yes, it is. He plays g4. Nordirbek Abdusattorov hasn't developed all of his pieces. He is under some pressure, although the engine really likes black's position, and Nordirbek calmly plays his knight to d7, g5. Not particularly a great idea, because Nordirbek now closes down the structure. Magnus does go king b1, but black now doesn't have to worry about the king side opening up. He plays his queen to e7. All that he has to think is how to get this bishop on c8 into the game, which may not be that difficult. At some point you can play b5, b4, and the bishop can come out here. Magnus wanted to make his move, but is still a little bit confused. I think the opening hasn't gone that well for him. He did go out, all guns blazing, but suddenly has found himself short of ammunition. Now, what next? Should he get to a simple developing position? He goes cd, which was logical, and ed opens up the bishop this side. So Nordirbek didn't even have to figure what way to get his bishop out. Bishop d3 played, some pressure on the g6 pawn, but it's no real sacrifice to be worried about. Knight goes to b6. Magnus plays his rook to c1. You can see that his moves are not really in sync. h4, g4 on the king side, suddenly king b1, king c1, rook c1. But he's just putting his pieces on decent squares and hoping that Nordirbek will give him an opportunity at some point. Bishop comes out to e6. Now the knight jumps back to e2. Bishop g4. He attacks the knight drops back and asks the question to the bishop. He takes it. Queen takes. Now if you see that black can, if at the right time, push the pawn to c5, it would be amazing. He goes f4. He weakens this e3 square. Nordirbek attacks it with rook e8. Magnus has to be careful. Next up, c5 coming in. This is becoming an amazing position for black, because the bishop will open up, the knight is well placed, and e3 pawn is weak. White knight isn't doing much on h2. What is Magnus going to do? He goes rook e1. Now Nordirbek, let's go c5. That is the move you want to play. And I think that is the move he's calculating. He has enough time on the clock. No, knight c4, not particularly a great idea, because now Magnus can actually take the pawn. And he can ask Nordirbek to prove his compensation, which does exist, I must say. But it's not enough for an advantage. It will give him equality. Takes, and now Magnus is a pawn up. Although you can see the light squares are a bit weak, the bishop is well placed, the knight is not in the game, so black does have compensation for the missing pawn. But is Nordirbek going to fight for some advantage here? He gives a check, and Magnus quickly brings his queen back. You don't trade and go into an endgame with Magnus pawn down. Nordirbek also knows that, so he has to keep the queens on the board. But where does he go with his queen? He goes back to d5. Can we push the pawn yet? Not really. The d4 pawn will hang, so Magnus first protects it. He's now going e4 in the position, and what will Nordirbek do? Suddenly from getting a very comfortable position out of the opening, he's now under pressure, and that's what happens with Magnus Carlsen. A lapse in concentration and he's all over you. Rook c d8 played. Black's rooks are nicely positioned in the center of the board, but I think it's time to push the central pawn. Magnus does it. He pushes his pawn to e4. Nordirbeck moves his queen back to e6, and now white needs to get his knight into the game, but not yet, because knight f3, the queen will start entering, and also the d4 pawn, e4 pawn, these are all soft pawns. So Magnus has to play carefully. He has the space and the pawns, but he now has to protect them. A good move here is queen f2, defending f2, f4, d4 and h4. The queen really belongs on that square. Magnus taking his time. He's down to 50 seconds on the clock, while Nordirbeck still has about a minute. Queen f2 found by Magnus. You know, he has this sense of harmony in the position, and he knows exactly where his queen belongs and so on, which is why he found this move. Now Nordirbeck, what is his next way of creating play? He goes rook d7. He says that this pawn is weak, I'm going to jump on it and try to put pressure. Magnus pushes his pawn to f5. Now he is actually in the driver's seat, and I think Nordirbeck will collapse here because his position is falling apart. f5 comes in and f6 is coming in fact, to shut down this bishop. Nordirbeck takes his time. The writing seems to be on the wall. He plays queen c4, f6 comes in, bishop f8. Look at the speed at which Magnus is making his moves. He knows these are now autopilot moves. The knight comes back. The knight can even jump into the center of the board now. Ooh, this is not looking good for Nordirbeck. He plays his rook to d6, just trying to improve the position very slightly, hoping against hope that Magnus blunders. But Magnus Carlsen does not blunder in such positions. Although here he's coming down to 30 seconds. Knight e5 played. He's attacked the queen. The queen has to move away. No point in sacrificing your rook right now. There's no real compensation. So you have to move your queen away. He brings his queen back. That is the tenacious way of defending. Knight goes back to d3. And now you can see that again both the pawns are well guarded for the time being. Nordirbeck goes in queen g4. Knight comes to f4. Blunder. He takes it. You can see Magnus Carlsen so upset with himself. He's missed it because rook takes rook is met with queen takes rook. Magnus has to move his rook, and now all of a sudden it's Nordirbeck who is in the driver's seat. He's clearly better. King a1, play b5. Just improve your position slowly, Nordirbeck. You are winning. He pushes forward. c5 is met with d5. He pushes c4. Magnus Carlsen now has to defend this inferior position. What a turn of events there. One miss by Magnus and Nordirbeck gets back. Rook d1, he takes the rook, queen takes, and now he pushes his pawn to c3. You must take with the pawn, because if you take with the queen, there is a pin here and you can chop off the pawn on d5. Magnus now down to 10 seconds, chops the pawn with the queen. Nordirbeck was so alert, takes here. You can see that the white king looks a bit exposed while the black king looks safe. And on the other hand, these pawns h4 can become really weak. h4, g5, f6, this entire pawn chain can just fall apart. He goes rook d1. Now have to play carefully. He comes back, but maybe Magnus is the one suddenly who's going to fight for the advantage. Rook e8 played. Good move. He takes the pawn. Queen goes to g4. Magnus brings his queen back. Rook comes to the center. Nordirbeck with just few seconds. Look at the way he's playing. Check comes in. He must take the knight. He doesn't. Now the f7 pawn is hanging. Nordirbeck once again finds the only move. Knight c8 is winning here for white. Can Magnus find it? Not enough time. He plays queen d7. Nordirbeck spots the defense. He takes, and now you can't take the rook because your rook is hanging. He actually takes it. Check, king up, check again. They both look at each other and shake hands. It's a draw.